Welcome, and let's start by sharing some information about the Borderscape project for those of you who don't know the Borderscape project yet. So the Borderscape project investigates how the Egyptian state formation process impacted and transformed the socio-spatial landscape of the Nile First Cataract region in the 4th and 3rd millennium BCE. It's founded by the Norway Grants, working together for a green, competitive and inclusive Europe, and by the National Science Center of Poland through the Poles Call. And is hosted by the Institute of Mediterranean and Oriental Cultures of the Polish Academy of Sciences. If you want to know more about the Borderscape project, please go to our website, the borderscapeproject.org, or to our social media accounts, or just write us an email. And this is not our first seminar. We already had 3 more seminars before the summer break, and they are all online. So if you want to see the recording, you can go to the YouTube channel of the Institute of Mediterranean and Oriental Culture, so IKŚiO, and you will find the 3 seminars by Chiara Barambilla, by Juan Carlos Moreno Garcia, by Oren Siegel. Today's seminar, Communities of the Desert, Communities of the Nile, Pastoral Nomads and Travelers at Wadi el-Hudi, is presented by Dr. Kate Liszka, who is a professor of history and the Pamela and Benson Herrera Fellow specializing in Egyptology at California State University, San Bernardino. She received a PhD in Egyptian archaeology from the University of Pennsylvania in 2012 and was a Kotzen postdoctoral fellow and a lecturer with the Society of Fellows at Princeton University from 2012 to 2015. Liszka is the director of the Wadi el-Hudi expedition in Egypt's Eastern Desert, along with Meredith Brandt and Brian Kramer. Since 2014, they have conducted several archaeological seasons, thus far discovering dozens of new archaeological sites and hundreds of new inscriptions. She enjoys studying questions of labor, administration, identity, pastoral nomads, and Egyptian-Nubian interaction in the ancient world. Her areas of expertise are Nubians in Egypt, the Magi, ethnicity and identity in antiquity, multicultural interactions in frontier regions, and large-scale mining expeditions in antiquity. So, Kate, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. So I'm just thrilled to be able to share with you guys what we have been finding at Wadi el-Hudi recently. So for those of you who don't know, Brian Kramer and Meredith Brand and I have been running the project at Wadi el-Hudi since 2014. So we're in our 9th year already. My, how time flies. Wadi el-Hudi is actually a very large area in the Eastern Desert, east of Aswan. It's just a little under 100 square kilometers. So there really is a lot of variations in this. And our last 2 seasons, both in 2021 and 2023, we decided to not necessarily work on our standard mining zones as much as we had previously, because we wanted to understand more about how the entire landscape worked as a whole. And so we started to basically look at areas that we hadn't seen at all. In the last 2 seasons, we really expanded out, and we had a new tactic of trying to investigate every blip that we've seen in the satellite imageries as well. And that has led us to a whole new understanding of Wadi el-Hudi. And as you can imagine, what we essentially end up getting is that Wadi el-Hudi is a much more complicated place than one thinks. It's actually a very, very busy place in the desert that has an incredibly rich history to it. So most people know Wadi el-Hudi as the place where ancient Egyptians mined things like amethyst, and then much later gold. But at the same time, there are lots and lots of minerals out there as well. And that's usually why people headed out into the desert, at least as far as these large expeditions go. So prior to 2021, what we saw for the history of Wadi el-Hudi were individual groups going out into the desert to mine these various minerals and then come back. And so you had these dispersant periods in time. And I'm going to give you the 2-minute history of Wadi el-Hudi as far as mining expeditions go, just to orient you. Normally, people know about the Middle Kingdom. During the Middle Kingdom, we have these very, very large amethyst mines at places like Site 9, which you see here, but also Sites 4 and 5. And there are settlements that are associated with these amethyst mines too. And there's thousands of people that are basically supplying these mines from Aswan. They had a road that actually led to Aswan that we discovered a couple of years ago, but you had lots of people out here. You had workers, both Egyptians and some Nubians who were doing the mining. You had administrators who were overseeing the work and passing out rations, doing other things like that. You had caravans of people bringing them food and water and other supplies. And you also had prospectors that would leave these mining communities and try to look for new places along the landscape. And you had hunters and other people who would gather resource that would do things like hunt gazelle, but also gather local wood. And then, of course, there was a very large contingency of soldiers that were running surveillance over the whole area. And all of these sites would actually work as a network together. So it wasn't just one space, but they probably would have sites 4, 5, and 9 all being worked at the same time within reason. Now, in the New Kingdom, there was no mining at Wadi el-Hudi. In fact, we have almost no evidence at all for the New Kingdom at Wadi el-Hudi, with the exception of the stele that you see on the left, that basically demonstrates that Egyptian administrators knew that the site still existed. They could actually get there following the road that you see on the right. And they did come out and visit. A guy by the name of Usur Satet came out and visited, but they decided not to open the mines. They were not interested in amethyst at that point. So we jump ahead to the Persian period, where we have Site 11, which is a middle-size settlement type of area where they were living on top of a hill, and they were probably actively mining down in Site 12. But again, we see a small, short-term work at this point in time for mining expeditions. And then we usually jump forward ahead in time again to the 2nd or 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE, when we have people of the Ptolemaic and early Roman period coming out to mine amethyst. This is specifically at Site 4, but they also had small scale mining in other places too. We might have some late Roman stuff, but not really. And then you see a spike much later again during the Islamic period, where we start to see active gold mining. I don't think that they were mining gold much earlier than the Islamic period, but we always find new evidence all the time. So at Site 3, you can see small scale but long-term gold mining. I love looking at that quern underneath the wall, so you can see levels of reuse in the site. But then the big one is Site 13, which is an absolutely massive mile-long site that has active mining and processing from the 9th, 10th century, but also much later and until today. So that's usually the history that people know about Wadi el-Hudi, where you have mining expeditions coming in and coming out. But we've discovered over the last two seasons that there's actually more than just miners out there. We actively have a complicated and continuous history of pastoral nomads and of travelers who are not there just for the mineral wealth. And we see this from the pre-dynastic period until today, or at least until 1938, as you can see on the image in the right. We recently discovered, actually just last summer, we found a travel journal from a German by the name of Hans Joachim van der Esch, who was living in Egypt in 1938. He was a He was a German bureaucrat in 1938. And at that point, he actually took on a lot of Bishareen guides, the local pastoral nomads, and he did a tour of the area basically between Khor Dikmet through Wadi el-Hudi. And he has lots of pictures of Wadi el-Hudi and several other places too. So it's been quite fun looking at his work over the last few months too. And then going back before the pre-dynastic period, I just want to tell you all briefly that we also actually have an enormous Paleolithic history at Wadi el-Hudi too. We brought out a team of Paleolithic specialists just last season in 2023, and they were flabbergasted by the amount of Paleolithic material we have there. Apparently, this 200,000 years ago was when the area would have been had a lot more water, a lot more trees, and you have a lot of these natural sandstone outcrops in the region that would act as natural housing or places where people could live during the Paleolithic period. And we have, in fact, multiple habitation areas of the Middle Stone Age period, and even places where they would perhaps gather flint supplies and a local flint quarry of the Middle Stone Age period too. And we might even have early Stone Age in the area as well. So this is a burgeoning new research venue for some of our colleagues, but it shows that Wadi el-Hudi actually has a much, much longer history than we also know of prior to this time too. So, as you know, from the Paleolithic period until today, this area that had once been a savanna dried out and went through several processes of desertification, right? And as most of you know, there were two major phases that occurred during the chronology that I'm going to be talking about today. So in about 3500 BCE, that is, in the pre-dynastic period, we have a period of time where we get further desertification, but at the same time, it was slightly damper than it is today. I mean, it was still a desert, right? But there was a little bit more water and there was a little bit more trees because of it, not much. But then around 2000 BCE in the early Middle Kingdom, we go through another period of dry desertification, where we actively get the desert that we have today, which is much drier than we are accustomed to. So depending on the period of time, if we're looking at the pre-dynastic period or the Old Kingdom or even the First Intermediate period, you have to imagine that it's just slightly ever so much wetter, slightly a few more plants, and perhaps people could actually stay in the area with their herds for a longer amount of time. But as it becomes more of a desert, it becomes really, really arid, and we might only have rain events, every 20 years, and it might take, decades for plants to regrow at this point. But even after it becomes the desert that it is today, there are still occasional rains, there are still occasional temporary water sources that just, dry up faster than we are accustomed to. So it is still possible for people to live and travel through this area within caution. Okay, so prior to 2021, the only evidence that we had for pastoral nomads at Wadi el-Hudi was at Site 6. And Site 6 is a very high mountaintop that comes to a natural peak. This is not a place that you live. This is a place that you climb to the top of and you can see the landscape from all directions. So it's a great place for viewing the landscape. And the pre-dynastic people actually started to draw inscriptions up here. And as you look through the inscriptions, we actually do have a number of earlier inscriptions that were done perhaps during the pre-dynastic period, sometimes during the early dynastic period, or sometimes even dynastic images. So you can see the longhorned cow on the left, and notice that he's a different patina than the person who's standing above him. On the right, you have a number of these figures with their arms crossed in front of them, some of them wearing kilts, some of them wearing penis sheaths. You also have this little sheep or ram thing, this other animal on the top with the horns. So these are more type of pastoral nomadic rock art of various periods. Now, when the Middle Kingdom soldiers got there, around 2000 BCE, they saw these earlier rock images and decided to draw themselves all over the same rocks too. And very often they would do things like stab the cow that you see on the left, or, you know, smite the sheep that you see on the right. They would integrate themselves into the art in various ways, but there's very much several hundred years between these different periods in time. And that was all we knew until 2021. And but in 2021, that's when we decided to start our larger survey and really look at places in the main Wadi el-Hudi. So a lot of the mining area is actually to the west slightly in these side branches of the wadis, whereas the main wadi is where you see the red line going through at this particular point. And that's when nobody had really recorded a lot of sites out there. And that's where we see most of the evidence for pastoral nomads and travelers in this area. And so you can actually see all of the red circles are some of the evidence we have. And a lot of them don't even have site numbers. There's just quantities and quantities out there of pastoral nomads and traveler data, but it's all along the main wadi. Now, the main wadi is centered by a giant mountain known as Jebel el-Hudi. Jebel means mountain, and Hudi is the namesake of Wadi el-Hudi. There's a bit of debate as to what it means, but one possibility is that it's the Arabic word for like guide or signpost. And it's basically a means of orienting you in the desert. And actually that mountain works that way. It is much darker on the landscape. And I will tell you that every single day that I'm out there, I usually find my way by seeing that mountain from far, far away. So it still works in that capacity. But this wadi also stretches to much larger places. If you travel to the north, it leads into the Wadi Abul Agag, which basically leads to just north of Aswan. So it's a great way to actually get out to the Nile Valley with ease. And then you can continue on it further south, going over to Berenike on the Red Sea coast, or there are parts that actually lead down to Sudan as well. So it makes sense to be a thoroughfare for people traveling to various places. And it's a great place for caravan routes to go. And we know this because a lot of the main wadi also has frequent cairns on the tops of our hillsides on either side of the wadi as well. And these help people navigate the zone. They tell them which way to go, where to turn, and all of these types of things. Plus, after the advent of camels, you know, something like 600 BCE, thereabouts, we also see a lot of camel caravan traffic in this area too. So far we've found 3 or 4 depictions of camels, but we also have camel caravan lines. So this might be a little hard to see, but on the right image, you see all of these diagonal lines in the satellite imagery. Those are basically made by camels walking up and down the Nile, or sorry, walking up and down the wadi. And this is a very important route for camels because camels only walk on sand. You cannot get them to walk on rocks or any type of rocky terrain. For that, you need donkeys. So that road that I showed you a couple of slides ago, which had been the main road that goes from Aswan to the desert mining areas, was great, but it was also very rocky. So the camels had to go a slightly longer way, but also one that they could walk to be successful. So you also see an increase in the amount of people in this area, especially travelers traveling through this area after the advent of the camel. Now, along the main wadi, you also have a lot of isolated individual burials. And these burials range from the pre-dynastic period, probably to the modern period. Some of them have numbers, some of them don't have numbers. They're usually one at a time. In a couple of cases, we've seen groups of, 4 to 8, meaning smaller groups, and I'll show you those in a couple minutes. But in the groups of 4 to 8, I would argue those are probably for pastoral nomadic families because they're choosing to be buried in the same area, and it would be quite a coincidence if they all died at the same time. Whereas the others, I would hazard to guess, are just unfortunate travelers that didn't make it. And these date to very, very different periods. I also wanted to say that in the mining area to the east, off of the main wadi, we have not yet found a single burial, and we've looked. And so it would seem that anybody who died while mining, their bodies would likely have been brought back to Egypt, whereas travelers were not. They were buried perhaps where they passed. Anyway, so these burials date to various periods. Some are disturbed and some are not disturbed. So the not disturbed ones, we have no idea what date they are. But for instance, this is an example of one that dates to the Fatimid period. We have a couple of sherds of the iconic glazed green, black, and magnesium dark purple Fayoumi ware bowl of an isolated traveler. But again, they date to various times. So I'm not going to talk about all of those, but I do want to hone in on 3 different types of areas today, where we can see 3 different communities and the activities that are associated with them. So first, we're going to talk about the areas in the north, sites 52, 42, and 43. These are perhaps from the pre-dynastic period and relate to death and burial or something similar. And then we'll look at site 51, which is where pastoral nomads and travelers are living. So you can see their life at that point. And then very briefly at the end, we'll talk about site 21, which is seemingly where pastoral nomads or perhaps desert Nubians are effectively mining in this area. So without further ado, let's move to the north. I believe that sites 42, 43, and 52 are a place where you see pre-dynastic pastoral nomadic communities. Now, a lot of this is based on pottery, and these are not our pots. These are from museums, and they were not found at Wadi el-Hudi. But I just want to show you very briefly for those of you who don't know anything about pre-dynastic pottery. In southern Egypt, for the last century or so, scholars have tried to put people into 2 categories. They would say in the pots equal people mantra that Nagata 2 pots are from southern Egypt are very much connected to Egyptians, and A group pots, which you see on the right, are connected to Nubians. And for decades, histories were written with, Egyptians having these pots and Nubians having these pots. But over the last 30 years, especially because of Maria Gatto's seminal work, as well as many, many other people, this pots equal people narrative is not true. And it has been demonstrated that there is a lot of complicated overlap and multicultural interactions, even in these early pre-dynastic communities. And just to give you a spoiler as to the next few slides, our work at Wadi el-Hudi supports that. It supports complicated multicultural narratives, and it's not simply just Egyptians versus Nubians based on their pots. So let me explain. Yes, and it was Maria Gatto especially, and a lot of the people of the Borderscapes project that helped move this trend to a more complicated understanding of the past, which is a good thing. Okay, so site 42 in particular, let's look at that one first. Site 42 is located on a very interesting part of the landscape. It's where you have the main wadi, but it then starts to bifurcate into another wadi to the left, and it goes around a bit of a hill. And if you wanted to get to Aswan, you actually have to turn left and follow the path that leads towards that Aswan at that point. So it is a major turn in the navigation from the Wadi el-Hudi coming down into the Wadi el-Hudi. And at this point, you have the low wadi, which still has a number of trees in it. You can actually see the dots on the satellite imagery on the right-hand side. Each of those are trees. I know, it's shocking in the desert. But then on the left, you start to get a slow rise and a slight crest of a slightly rockier area. And it just gives you this mystical overview of the lower wadi and the general area. So it creates this really beautiful vista of people in these areas, or of the space in these areas, excuse me. And stretching across this entire way, we actually have a number of features. So the southern crest seems to be where pre-dynastic activity might have been. But we also have perhaps Ptolemaic or Roman activity in the middle crest and in the northern crest, although a lot of this still needs to be researched in full. And I will tell you that our team was only there for about 2 hours. So there's still much, much more to be learned, and we do need to come back here in the future. But the southern crest is particularly interesting because it's kind of oversees the area below and gets this beautiful vista of the landscape. And in the southern crest, we have a number of these features that seem to be once made circular pits. So there's a group of 8 here that are essentially in a line. 7 of them are undisturbed, or at least they were as of 2021. And these archaeologically, it looks like these had just been dug out pits that something was put in, and then it was later filled in. They're each between 3 to 4 meters wide, and the whole area stretches about 50 meters along this crest. The rocks on top are perhaps leftover spoil from when they actually dug the pit, 5,000 years ago or so. They did not place them in any type of superstructure area, but because they were dug out and filled in, you can actually kind of see where that area was. Now, feature 4 was disturbed. And in front of feature 4, we found a couple of handmade pottery sherds that you can see here. And I'd like to give a big thank you to Maria Gatto for helping us identify them. And she had noted when we showed her pictures of them that they essentially are of Nagata-2 types of pots. And as you remember, the traditional mantra was that Nagata-2 was Egyptian. However, these pots are also 30 kilometers in the desert. So whoever brought these pots there are actively, purposefully in the desert at this period in time. And it shows that there are connections out here in the desert to the people in the Nile Valley as well. But we haven't excavated here. So my hypothesis is that we have some burials in these locations, but we do need to excavate to find out. It's still a working theory. However, just south of that, at site 43, we have another very, very similar site. And similarly, this is another place where 2 wadis seem to come together, or you have a mouth of a second wadi opening onto a first one. Again, you have a raised crest with a slightly rockier type of terrain. And there are, in fact, 4 burials that were purposely placed in the central area overlooking a much more beautiful vista below. So I would argue that the people who found and chose site 42 and site 43 were adhering to similar landscape principles. They're very similar types of things in the landscape that they're looking for at this time. Now in this area, we definitely have burials because all 4 of them have been disturbed. And you can see that because there is human bone on the surface, a lot of human bone on the surface, especially things like, you know, parts of spines and pelvises and other things like that. Each of these circles are in a diamond-shaped pattern that is over about 10 or 15 meters, and they clump together purposely in these areas. And similarly, they probably did not originally have superstructures over them. I believe that the rocks creating the circles on the outside are either from the original excavations or also from the looting too. It doesn't seem to be purposeful in many ways. So about the similar size, about the similar structure. But what's also very interesting is that we did find 3 pots in this area too. And considering the amount of human bone that was on the surface, finding only remnants of 3 pots means that these were very sparse burials. They probably were just buried with 1 pot each, I would hazard to guess. But again, we don't know that definitively. And thanks again to Maria for helping us identify these. The 2 on the left, again, seem to be Nagata 2, whereas the one on the right is A group. And that was traditionally thought to be Nubian. So we have a very interesting context where I would argue 4 groups together in a purposefully positioned location would probably be a family of people connected to the desert, like pastoral nomads. But this family is also choosing both Egyptian and Nubian pots together. So you have this interesting combination that really means that just because a person has a Nubian pot, it doesn't make them Nubian, and just because they have an Egyptian pot, it doesn't make them Egyptian. So there's something much more complicated going on here. So then we move north to site 52, which we just discovered last January. And I haven't even seen it in person yet. Brian Kramer found this and brought home a giant bag of pots that we were very excited about. But in this case, we have 2 perhaps burials again. One seems to be disturbed, whereas the other one doesn't. And the other one does have a purposeful placement of the stones as a superstructure around the top of it, which is very interesting. He did not see any bone on the surface when he was there. So again, we can't definitively demonstrate that these are burials, but there are also other explanations for this too. And at the same time, he found a number of these pieces of pottery in the right next to the disturbed area on the south side. There are 2 different types of fabrics involved here, so we probably have at least 2 pots, and you do have this red heavy ripple wear type of coarse type of pottery fabric that is usually associated with the A group. So if we look at these 3 places together, they're all within 2 kilometers of one another, and they do seem to be isolated, but at the same time, they are close enough that they're probably not isolated. They're probably part of a much larger type of community. And then when we expand out beyond Wadi el-Hudi, we have a lot of areas within 20 kilometers where we have evidence of rock art, we have evidence of pre-dynastic ware, and it seems like the people in this part of the Eastern Desert is effectively communicating with all of the larger Aswan region. Because you see a lot of these people moving through these different areas. So there are people who are connected to the desert and to the Nile Valley and to the larger region. Now, just to, I guess, tease some of you ceramicists in the audience, on the last day of the last hour of the season in 2019, isn't that always when it happens? We found, well, we didn't find this pot. Somebody handed us this pot. One of the local miners gave this to our inspector. He's a modern miner, and he said that he found it when he was on a walk. So as you probably know, this is a late pre-dynastic wavy handle jar that's Nagata 3B. It is very iconic as far as time goes. They're usually found in tombs. So we haven't found it yet, but there might also be Nagata 3 type of activities somewhere in the area too, meaning that it's not just Nagata 2, but it probably has a longer period of time. And we're still looking for this one. Anyway, moving away from people being buried in the desert, I want to talk about people living in the desert. And that takes us to Site 51. Site 51, we discovered just in 2023. In fact, it was discovered by Maria Vecchiotti and Omar Farouk, who are both invaluable members of our team. And this place immediately overhauled our entire understanding of how pastoral nomads are living in the desert and how travelers are traveling through the desert as well. It is really a remarkable space. So for about an 80-meter stretch of desert, you get this sandstone cliff that naturally creates a lot of crevices, a lot of alcoves and spaces, or like even these mini caves that create continuous shade in the desert, making it a good 10 to 20 degrees cooler when you're in the shade here than out in the hot sun. And there are a lot of these natural spaces in here where you can actually find shelter. There's probably a good 6 or 7 of these natural alcoves in this general area. And one room in particular is quite large. It's about 8 meters by 10 meters with a ceiling that's about 1 meter high. And it has a giant rock like right in front of it, meaning that it is perpetually in shade and cool. And also a lot of sand and loose dirt has blown into it. So this would be an ideal place to sleep on a hot day and to rest on a hot day. And also you have a lot of these rocks and boulders that basically go all over the landscape that are really easy to climb. And so you can climb up to various tiers, and they certainly took advantage of the entire site from top to bottom. And you can see a lot of activities on different levels as well. So there's a lot of natural elements that were created by this sandstone outcrop. But then the pinnacle of all of this comes to a natural feature that seems to be a natural water seep. So when it happens to rain in the eastern desert, water would be funneled through this space and easy to catch in this area. Now that of course is not that frequently, but still it would be a great natural funnel to collect the water below. So surprise, surprise, people found this natural place, not just once, not just twice, but perhaps thousands of times over thousands of years. And it's a space that sheltered pastoral nomads and travelers from the pre-dynastic period until today. In fact, we even know that Van der Esch's team had to escape a sandstorm while they were there, and they took shelter at Site 51 for 2 different days, for 2 days in 1938 as well. Now, people would perhaps live and work in these rock areas behind, but most of their trash is on the plain right in front of this as well. And on this sloping area in front is where we have just tons and tons of broken pottery, perhaps tens of thousands of sherds. Now, the bulk of these date to the Islamic period, something like the 9th and 10th century. And this is when we know that the active camel caravan route was going right in front of this, so it would have been passed by a lot of people. But we also have an occasional, Roman sherd, a couple of Middle Nubian sherds, possibly in a group sherd, but really all of this still needs to be analyzed. It still needs to be collected and properly surveyed. We just need more time out at this very cool place to say anything definitive. But I would guess that this place also has very deep stratification if we ever do get a chance to excavate it. And people were probably using it for thousands of years in many cases. So we see evidence for both pastoral nomads and for travelers here. And this also includes ancient Egyptian travelers too. So for instance, there's this very cool inscription on incredibly large spaced out hieroglyphs that seems to say Hotepi, who discovered this place. And then around the corner, you get his friend, a guy by the name of Nigebu, who seems to be with him at the same period, place, and time. These probably date to the late Old Kingdom or first intermediate period based on the paleography of the sign that you see in the lower corner, and the fact that the glyphs are really big. But you know, that it's interesting. But regardless, it seems like these people were moving through this area and claiming that they discovered it, even though there's probably people who had been there before as well. We also see lots and lots of evidence for pastoral nomads here and a lot of activities of what they were doing. And they spent longer amounts of time than just 1 or 2 days and writing their names on the wall. We see an active work zone. And most of what we have is evidence for grinding. So we have hundreds of cupulas or grinding slicks where people are actively using stones and grinding things into every surface. And these occur everywhere. They are on the tops, on the bottoms, on the sides, in the back, in the front, just there. Anywhere you look, somebody sat and used this sandstone surface as a grinding surface. So it seems like pastoral nomads who would have stayed here with their herds were perhaps also gathering plants of the desert and then grinding these plants down. We know from ethnographic work that a lot of desert pastoral nomads are collecting things like wormwood and ben tree seeds and argol, and the ben tree seeds in particular can be used to create a fine cooking oil. So perhaps that's what they're grinding, but a lot of other activity still needs to be done in this particular area too. We do have also several grinding stones strewn throughout the site. And we have 2 different areas where it shows evidence for sharpening of materials as well, as you can see both on the rock on the ground and then the large boulder on the side. So they are actively working in these areas. And the rest of the time, besides, you know, grinding down plants and sharpening things, they were probably tending to their flocks in their areas. And there's modern sheep scat there, so it seems like this place is still being used by pastoral nomads of late. But we have every reason to believe that this happened for thousands of years too. In particular, because we see rock art inscriptions, rock art depictions all over the entire area. And just like the grinding slicks, these can be on any surface, usually at eye level, but they're often on the ground that you walk on the sides of things, in the crevices, in between, in the back, but also in the front where people can view them. Really every surface, even some on the very, very top tier on the floor. These pieces of rock art can be found absolutely everywhere. And there are 4 general types of rock art, I would argue. There are some that seem to be inspired by hieroglyphs. So we have the inscription of Hotepi down on the lower left that I already talked about. But we also have things like the seated man on the upper right, the sandals, the hourglass types of images that you get at a lot of other sites, especially Dakhla Oasis. A lot of our parallels seem to come from there. And if they are paralleled with Dakhla Oasis, it might mean that some of these come from the late Old Kingdom. But really, these types of geometric designs can be from the late Old Kingdom through the late period as well. The one in the middle is quite interesting because you have the hand and then you have this geometric head shape thing. But in between them, I know it's tiny, but in between them, you get a tiny little achet sign, which is the Egyptian hieroglyph for the horizon. So it's an interesting composition that you would have this classic Egyptian hieroglyph in between 2 very non-classic type of Egyptian human decorations as well. So if anybody knows any parallels for that one, please let me know. Anyway, the second type of major inscription are cows. There are just so many cows on lots and lots of different surfaces. And, you know, cattle rock art is incredibly common. There are similar cattle cattle depictions in Wadi Waswas, as Maria has recently found, but then also in the much larger area as well. And there are, so these are actually quite interesting, but there's one in particular that I want to draw your attention to. We seem to have this spotted cow with horns, and then there's a man holding his tail. This is a classic type of cattle inscription that there are probably about 10 different examples of at various sites. The parallels usually date from the late Old Kingdom to the late period, but people think it's a sign of ownership as well. And so you see from these parallels that a lot of these rock arts seem to be skewing later, like Old Kingdom-ish, but possibly later than that as well. So we're getting other periods in time. Now, the third major type of inscriptions is, of course, wild animals. Lots and lots and lots of ibexes. But we do occasionally get a gazelle or an oryx, as you can see on the upper left. But these large sweeping back horn ibexes are actually quite interesting. And we have two possible hunting scenes. I know they're hard to see, but in the upper right, you seem to have what I guess is a dog chasing an ibex, question mark. And then in the lower right, this is hard to see again, but there is a man holding a bow and arrow that is pointed towards the longhorn animal as well. So it's quite interesting that these are fitting into larger types of venues. Now, these types of images, both with the cattle and the ibexes, are incredibly common, again, throughout the entire Eastern Desert, Western Desert, Sudanese Desert, and it shows that the people who are drawing them are effectively parts of these larger communities as well. They're not just here, they're going to lots and lots of other places too, or this is standard types of practice for them. Now, the fourth type of inscriptions that we get here are tally marks or notches. These are very fascinating. We have 6 sets of them that we found. There might be more. And they seem to be 14 or 15 tallies, and one of them has, in fact, 22 tallies. And similar tally marks have been found in the Eastern Desert, in the Western Desert, in the Sudanese Desert, at Dakhla Oasis. And then one of our team members, Amy Wilson, also found a parallel in Saudi Arabia when she was working there too, that she sent me a picture of. So these type of tally marks end up in pastoral nomadic places everywhere. And as Forster and Copper argued for Dakhla Oasis, these tally marks might actually be counting the number of days that pastoral nomads stayed on a particular space or a particular area with their herds. So if they're right, then it would be an argument that the pastoral nomads who came to Site 51 were there for about 14 to 22 days, which makes sense. They would tend their animals in these particular areas. And so you can see them like living in this space for a short amount of time, a couple of weeks, and then moving on to another zone once they had perhaps collected in the local resources, eaten the local trees, and then moved to a different area. That is, the sheep and goat would eat the local trees. Let me rephrase that. Also, pastoral nomadic use does not stop at this period in time either. Just to show you, we slightly further south at Site 33, we do have evidence for modern pastoral nomads using the area too. We have a couple of WUSM marks that show pastoral nomadic boundaries, and then we have I believe 3 sherds of Eastern desert wear, which is substantially later, but it's the idea of people still moving through the desert as we see thousands of years earlier. So you have to imagine this place as a very active place where people are living, moving through. But in 2021, and then also in 2023, we found Site 21 that gets to the 3rd level of activity for deserty peoples. And Site 21 is really interesting because it seems that pastoral nomads or some sort of people connected to the desert are also mining. So Site 21 is effectively an amethyst mine. It's a medium-sized amethyst mine, and it has a couple of huts and some other dry stone features. And so you can actually see the area of activity out there. But and in 2023, we actually excavated 2 of these areas across the site. And what's very interesting is that this is only about 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers away from Site 9. Site 9 is our very big Middle Kingdom mining area where 1,000 workers with the Egyptian government were right there. And here, you're only a couple of kilometers away. And these people are essentially contemporary. Site 21 essentially dates in general to the Egyptian Middle Kingdom. And so these people mining there are doing it perhaps at the same time as or just after these other large expeditions as well. But what we get and what we find out when we actually excavated this place and really studied it was that the people at Site 21 are not at all connected to the work at Site 9 or Site 5 or Site 4 or any of the large expeditions. And that is a little odd because those large places also did send out, other smaller mining prospect areas, and we can see them mining in other locations too, looking for things. But Site 21 is effectively a totally separate type of area. And we know this because there doesn't seem to be a path that connects them at all, but also their diet, their tools, and their pottery are all very, very different than what's going on at the large Middle Kingdom mining areas. So they're not being supplied by the same administrative apparatus in any way. They are probably not eating the same type of meat products as these large expeditions either. And so they do seem to be a disconnected group. So why in the world do we think that these are possibly desert Nubians doing this? Well, there are several possible markers that are circumstantially related to Middle Nubians in many cases. So for instance, we have ostrich eggshell pieces that were found in the actual excavation. But then about 150 meters away en route to Site 21 from the main wadi, we also found a broken ostrich eggshell that was across the entire area. And ostrich eggshells are sometimes connected with Nubian types of cultural traditions, especially in active living areas. But we also have odd types of stone axes that Stuart Tyson Smith argued are sometimes related to Nubian cultural traditions, but not always. Regardless, it's different than the tools that are used in the main Egyptian expeditions on the other side. And we also found this strange geode on the right too, which we have no idea what it was used for. But similar geodes are also found at the C group settlement of Wadi el-Hudi, and their excavators similarly didn't know what they were used for, but it seems to be somehow actually incorporated into their daily life and their activities in these particular cases. So I recognize that these are all circumstantial, but then we also have the pottery, which I'm just going to very, very briefly skip through here because we're running short on time. Meredith and I also have a forthcoming article in Sudan and Nubia that goes into this in a little more detail if you're interested, or we're always happy to talk to you about it separately too. But just very, very, very briefly, there's a lot of Nubian pottery found here. And that was our first, trigger to this place being special, right? And it's just strewn all over the surface, as you can see. There were hundreds of sherds, but when Meredith reconstructed a lot of them, they essentially were able to form about 8 pots, but perhaps more as she continues to work on this. Now, these Nubian vessels include consumption for eating food and liquids, and then also cooking pots too. But at the same time, we do have occasional Egyptian bowls for consumption and Egyptian pots for storage. So even though you have, again, you have this mix of Egyptian and Nubian pottery working together, but we have a very, very high amount of Nubian pottery, much more than at other locations. Now, what makes these 8 pots special is that these are not our standard Middle Nubian pots at the time. And as many of you know, for the Middle Nubian period, i.e. something like the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, we ceramicists for the last century or more have been dividing these into C group, Pangrave, and Kerma, each of which have their own, decorative markers, et cetera, but especially over the last decade or two, several scholars have demonstrated time and time again, and we agree with them, that the boundaries between these different groups are not satisfactory. We need to basically redo the whole thing. And that's part of a larger mission that's going on right now. But the pots that we found here support the idea that Middle Nubian peoples are not just cleanly divided into 3 groups. We in fact have a lot of overlap and a lot of weird mixes here that you don't get in other places. The very, very short version is that some of these pots have decorations that are similar to C group, but at the same time, they are mixed in very non-standard ways that you probably wouldn't actually get together as a unit. 2 of the pots have decorations that don't seem to be connected with any of these other Middle Nubian groups. But the big thing is that the clay recipes that make up the fabrics are also absolutely non-standard. And there's 3 different ones. So very standard C group and Pangrave pottery would usually be made out of Nile silt. But Meredith has essentially outlined 3 different fabrics that have incredibly odd types of inclusions mixed in, and that their clays are also weird, that often mix together deserty things mixed with Nile-y things. They're very weird. And I know that that is brief, but if you want to know more, we will happily tell you about it. And the point is that a lot of these look reminiscent of people who use Nubian pottery in the Nile Valley, but the clay also shows that the potters who made them had some sort of connections to the desert, or were making them in non-standard ways. So tentatively, the people who made these pots had connections to the desert, and the people who then purchased these pots and used these pots also then brought them into the desert and had connections to the desert. And so we then hypothesize that the people who were doing these minings are just not normal or standard Nile Valley Nubians, but they're perhaps some sort of Middle Nubians connected with the desert at this time. And perhaps they're pastoral nomads who are there working and adding to a part of their local economy. But if they were, they certainly didn't bring their animals with them at this point. So there's a lot of questions still to be had. But you see these, but what you see at Wadi el-Hudi is that the whole place is a very complicated and busy place. It is not empty space where pharaonic missions just kind of show up, mine, and then go away. No, you have to imagine that we have a massive landscape with lots of different peoples, lots of different communities. We have pastoral nomads moving through, we have small scale mining, and we have travelers going through there essentially continuously at all times. So thank you very much. I'm so glad you had me here today.
Thank you very much. This has been really, really interesting. A lot of questions, I hope. A lot of discussion to start, because it's really, really interesting to see how much close is, for instance, to sites that we have in our concession area, in the Aswan Komombo Archaeological Project concession area, but there are also many things that are different. So it's really the variety of evidence that you can find in the desert, even nearby, you know, so a connected desert is really outstanding. So, do we have any questions? Questions? Anybody? Yes, Marco. Mute yourself.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi, good evening. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's really remarkable work. I have a question concerning the small mining scale. If there is any hypothesis yet about what what were these people doing with the stuff they mined? So if there is any hypothesis of let's say, broadly speaking, economic networks and with whom, within which kind of structure. So if you could, let's say, expand a little bit on that. Thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah, so the large expeditions, those are run by the pharaoh, and their large amounts of amethyst are going into the royal treasury. But smaller groups of people that are disconnected are that amethyst or other minerals is entering their own personal economies in many ways. And they could keep them, they could sell them, they could trade them, they could use them to buy other products. But at this, so we don't really know the larger mechanism, but at the same time, we see evidence for this. There are a handful of Pangrave burials that have bits of amethyst in them. And if amethyst is really only gifted out by the king, as you see with the large amounts of amethyst, there'd be no way that a Pangrave person, and I know that that's problematic, but a burial in Balabish would have, these tiny little amethyst beads in them as well. There's also been a couple found in Kerma as well, like the actual city of Kerma on the Third Cataract. So that's quite interesting. So I would go with personal informal economy trade, but I don't have a more nuanced answer than that, though. But you can see it hinting out.
I think we also found an amethyst bead in one of the Pangrave cemeteries we dug in the West Bank, and yeah. This is really very interesting because we always assume that if you find something in a Pangrave cemetery, there is possibly Egyptian related, so that comes from Egypt. So like an amethyst, and also the mining are managed by Egyptians, and so this is something that they get from Egyptians. Instead, maybe not. Maybe there is another network within the Nubian group, so that has nothing to do with the Egyptians.
Exactly. I think Aaron D'Souza found some in Heracompolis with Renee Freeman's work as well that dates to about the same time. Plus, if you think about this, amethyst mining at Wadi el-Hudi only started during the reign of Montuhotep IV, so beginning of the Middle Kingdom. However, bits of amethyst have also been found from the pre-dynastic period through the tomb of King Jair, and then in the Old Kingdom. It's few and far between, but there is enough to know that somebody was mining amethyst somehow prior to the large expeditions starting. So yeah, I mean, I think the informal economy and its interest for other people is a very powerful thing.
That's right, yeah. Questions? Other questions? If not, I have a comment on the Middle Nubian pottery. Sorry.
Please.
Indeed, this kind of grooved decorations, you have examples in C group context, no? In Upper Egypt and in Lower Nubia. But indeed, they are not so common. Instead, you have many, as you said, they are also different from the things that you can find along the Nile in the Eastern Desert. For instance, in Wadi Kashab, on the surface was found a pot very similar with this kind of horizontal grooved decorations. I think also farther south there are in Sudan this kind of decorations. So really we should start, wondering if there is another group. So these nomads of the Eastern Desert, we don't know so much. And this kind of productions are actually from the Eastern Desert. And what you see in the Nile Valley is just, traded pots. And so it's, or the reverse instead. So not Nubian pots into the desert, but actually desert pots that can, reach communities along the Nile.
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I think that with the advent of petrography and the increasing use of petrography to look at clays, and Meredith is in the process of doing that for several of these pots as well, that it's going to complicate a lot of these issues and look at the recipes differently. And Meredith is raising her hand. So why don't you just jump in before I say the wrong thing?
Jump in.
No, that was such a good talk, Kate. Thank you. Yeah, so we're working on the petrography now. I started it, and I found a day that Mary Ownby was also at IKŞiO, and I said, Mary, you got to look at this. So she looked at it, gave some comments, and some of it is a bit more complicated. So Mohammed Hamdan is coming early December, and we're gonna sort this out. But in general, the spoiler thing is there are some clays that they're not at Site 21, but some quasi-sea group looking desert middle Nubian pots that have desert rocks, big fragments of some kind of very bizarre granitic rocks. I have no idea what this clay is. So that's when we decided to bring in Mohammed Hamdan. So there definitely is, clays that are very much from the desert. The ones at Site 21, it's a bit more complicated because there seems to be kind of a mixture. And it's not fully as strongly 100% connected to the desert as this fourth fabric group that we have from other sites have the kind of middle Nubian pottery. So that's becoming really interesting, and I think it would be fantastic to get people working together that have found this stuff. And I'm very much convinced that people have these fabrics at lots of other sites. And it just was kind of, oh, well, I guess it's a sandy fabric, but it's not. These are rock fragments, and there's some interesting things going on there.
Indeed, yeah, that's true. We always think that, what is in the desert always comes from the Nile Valley. Doesn't matter if it's Egyptian or Nubian, but we never see, the reverse of things done in the desert and reaching the Nile Valley.
True, but you also need a lot of water to make a pot. So there's the added problem of where do you get both of those, even if you are using these desert rocks and clays and things. So it's a mystery we still need to crack.
Actually, that was my other question. Do you have any source of water in the area?
Water. This is an active mystery that we're trying to sort out too. So there are a couple of, so we have the water seep that I showed in Site 51. However, if it's not raining, then there's nothing there. There are a couple of places where you might have some natural playas that are creeping up. But again, without rain, a lot of them would be dried out. And there are some places like at Site 12 where you have a big giant cliff and then a mine in the middle. And it almost looks like at some point after it rains, the cliffs funnel things down into this mine. And then people later then somehow created a hafir, which you usually only get in Sudan, which is basically a place to collect water that you build a wall around. And if that's true, then this would be one further north. But all of those features would only work after it rains for a nominal amount of time. We have not found any wells yet. And Fechri, who was there, published his book in 1952, and then Ian Shaw and Robert Jameson went out in 1993 for a short amount of time, speculated that Site 8 was a well. It's on a lower part of the terrain, so possibly closer. But we went there several times, and we even excavated a part of a trench. It's not the full thing, but it really seems to be just another mid-sized mine. It does not seem to be a well. After we basically just went down like 2 meters through sand. It's not very deep. We still need to do more, but you can see along the cliff face that came down, and there are a couple of quartz fragments that stick out that show that there might have actually been a quartz or amethyst type of material there. Plus you have all of these very horizontal striations in the sand that show, you know, like sand events over time, but they are absolutely, they're absolutely horizontal. They're not ripply. And when Mohammed Hamdan, the geologist from Cairo University, saw that, he said that he didn't think it was a well, because if it was a well, water would be pushing up from the bottom and making those striations ripply, and ours are flat. So he thinks it's also a mine. So our best guess is that these large missions right now are bringing in water from the Nile Valley, which would be like 20 kilometers. That's, I mean, I'm also not satisfied with that either.
Yeah.
But we don't have anything else at this point, unless if you know, the Egyptian government timed their expeditions to take advantage of a random rain. You know, hey, it rained this year, let's go. But that's also, that's a lot of, you know, like quick planning to get 1,000 people up and running. You know, it's
that's right. Wouldn't be a lot of jars found in the area? Then Brian.
No, we also don't have, along a lot of our areas, we also don't have, you know, broken water jars. And Brian probably wants to chime in because he also has thought about this question a lot too. So, Brian.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
We can.
Excellent. Okay, sorry. Yes. So for the expeditions, the Middle Kingdom expeditions, the water source, which is obviously a critical question. I think we still have to come back to what Kate said, that at some level, at the most substantial level, they're bringing things from the Nile Valley for the most part. For the nomadic population, however, that's a completely different question. And taking into account the possible more than what is observable abundance of water sources in a period of time when there was more rain, it's still pretty sparse in Wadi el-Hudi. And I missed the beginning of the talk. Kate introduced Fonda Esch's kind of travel log. I think his travel log from 1938 is hugely concerned with water. He was basically trying to get from one well to the next to survive in 40-degree temperatures in the Eastern Desert in May. And so he was kind of on the edge of what is possible. But just to answer the question correctly, there is a number of sources of water in the area on the maps of the British survey. So there's in the Abu Agag Wadi, it's named after Magal, so a seasonal water source. In Von der Esch's account, he talks about getting water from this area critically in May. There's other ones in there's 2 beaters that are further down the wadi in Abu Hashim and in I can't remember that. Hebel is another close by, but these are on fairly well-known, well-traveled routes. So within like a 3 to 4 day journey, you can get from one to the next, at least according to what his account shows us. That still, I think, leaves the question of how would a nomadic population have been coordinating this to manage to mine and get the water to survive while they did that. It must have implied there were people going back and forth getting that as much as they could. I mean, as many people just getting the supplies as who were actually digging in that hole. Yeah, so sorry to chime in and take your thunder, but yeah, I've been trying to figure that question out too, because it is a huge
I'm glad you did. Thank you.
Yeah, it's never easy with the water. Okay, any other question, guys? We have run a little bit late today, but yes, Serena.
Hi, good evening, and thank you so much for this very interesting lecture. I have a question about the two individuals you were speaking about, those two mentioned on the inscriptions. Are there any other evidence of them? I mean, are their names located in other places or sites?
You mean Hotepi and Nigebu?
Yes. Yeah.
No, that's the only place, and that type of incredibly large hieroglyph is not found in many places either. So I mean, I guess we could look further in other rock art sites that go beyond Wadi el-Hudi, but I haven't found them elsewhere. Brian, I'm guessing you haven't seen them evidenced anywhere else either, or even just the Wabu sign that, you know, for discovering.
Sorry, I'm going to jump in because they don't have titles. It's hard to say who they are. That's always a challenge.
So they just mention the name, nothing else, right?
As far as I can read, is just the name. And then a space, and then this very tall sign that is, to my best of identifying it, is the hieratic version of the Uba sign. And I haven't found a parallel for that, but Uba means to discover a place, so that could be what's going on there. It's an unusual inscription for those reasons, as well as the paleography, which is a mix of hieratic and hieroglyphs, but we see that a lot at Wadi el-Hudi and other places. If they had titles, it would be easier to say whether they're the same people.
Of course.
It's just a hard challenge.
But I don't think we get these personal names anywhere else in our corpus, at least. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Of course.
Any more questions? No? If not, I guess it's time to stop. I want to thank Kate again, and also Brian and Meredith for joining us. This has been really an interesting presentation, at least, you know, for the Borderscape project very much, because this is part of our, let's say, area of interest, and also see, you know, this new evidence is very much interesting for us. It's also interesting to see how many new evidences are coming out from the Eastern Desert, not just in our area, so the southern, let's say, Eastern Desert, but also farther north. There are new expeditions working in the area. So it would be really important to coordinate all our investigations or our projects, because at the end of the day, these, as we know, are mobile people. And so it's more likely that what you get there in Wadi el-Hudi are the same people that we get farther north, or other people, you know, other expedition farther north. So it would be really interesting to put all of them together. I want also to thank everybody who joined us today, and I'm just telling you that next week, so next Wednesday, we are going to have another lecture, seminar, inshallah. So let's see, I will let you know very soon in the coming days. Okay, so thank you very much and see you soon.